Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you all to today's colloquium, which is actually a very special occasion for our department. It's part of the Loeb lectureship. So the Morris Loeb lectureship was established in 1953 by the Department of Physics under the terms of the bequest of Morris Loeb, who got his bachelor's degree in 1883. So the Loeb lecturer presents a series of lectures, starting with the Monday colloquium, which is for a general audience, and followed by several more talks, which are for less specialized audiences. So this week we'll have two more lectures on Tuesday and Wednesday at the same time and the same place. So this year's Loeb lecturer is Professor Cristina Marchetti, the Distinguished Professor of Physics at the University of California in Santa Barbara. And I will let my colleague David Nelson introduce our speaker.
So thank you, Tim, and welcome to everybody. I'm getting a little bit of an echo over here, so I'm going to stand over here. And just so that you know, the lectures on Tuesday and Wednesday, which will be equally fantastic, will be one on the dynamics of active fluid interfaces. That's tomorrow on Tuesday at 4:30 in this place. And on Wednesday, the rheology of dense biological tissues. So it's a particular pleasure for me to introduce Cristina, an outstanding condensed matter physicist, a pioneering woman whose contributions to science span several decades. She first came to prominence with work on pinning, thermal fluctuations, and vortices in high-temperature superconductors, with papers predicting new phases of matter for type 2 superconductors. Another paper on viscous electricity, now a fashionable topic in the graphene community. She also made many contributions to the general problem of defects in glassy motion and elastic manifolds, all the while helping build at Syracuse University, while being a department chair, built it into a powerhouse of soft condensed matter physics. Thank you, Tim. Before departing with her theoretical physics husband, Mark Bowick, to another powerhouse, UCSB. And these achievements alone are, I think, a remarkable tribute to Cristina's drive and intelligence. In addition to all this, over the last 20 years, Cristina has made amazing contributions to the study of active materials, a new field of biologically inspired physics that requires understanding instability of cytoskeleton filaments in solution, the hydrodynamics of bacterial suspensions, and the dynamics of what's sometimes called topological clocks in active nematic vesicles. Cristina has been at the forefront of theoretical efforts to understand the hydrodynamics of soft active matter, a field that has attracted both outstanding theorists and experimenters, including our own Dan Needleman. These efforts culminated in her lead authorship of a masterful Reviews of Modern Physics article, where she combined her insights and remarkable leadership capabilities to assemble a who's who of condensed matter theorists from all around the world. This review, which was published in 2013, has now received 3,200 citations or so. And for those of you who are counting, that's 350 a year. And it's a tribute, I think, both to her extraordinary science and her remarkable organizational skills. Evidently, she's very good at herding cats. And Cristina's status and service to the scientific community are also reflected in her term as chair of the advisory board of the KITP, her chairing of a topical group in nonlinear and statistical physics for the APS, her co-organization of influential science conferences, and among other things, she's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. And in 2013, she was awarded the inaugural Leo Kadanoff Prize in condensed matter physics. And her citation, this is where I will conclude, for the Kadanoff Prize reads, for original contributions to equilibrium and non-equilibrium statistical mechanics, including profound work on equilibrium and driven vortex systems and fundamental research and leadership in the growing field of active matter. Her talk today is entitled The Physics of Active Matter, Birds Flock, Bees Swarm,
and Fish School. Welcome.
Well, thank you, David, for that much too kind introduction. It's a true pleasure and an honor to be here today to give this lecture. I have spent some time here at Harvard, at least twice in the past on sabbatical. We're trying to remember today, 1989, I believe, and 1998 or 98, where I worked with David actually, and some of the work he cited was actually work done with him. And I really enjoyed it. So again, it's really a pleasure to be back and see some familiar faces. And I even have some former students and postdocs here in the audience. So thank you very much to all of you for coming. As David indicated, what I hope to do today is tell you a little bit about this field of active matter that has really become very popular over the last 20 years. And I will try to hopefully explain to you why it is interesting and why it has become so popular. I thought I would start with a bit of history. So the field really started when physicists back in 1995 thought that they could actually use statistical mechanics to describe phenomena such as the flocking of birds. And in fact, it wouldn't do justice to the field to start a colloquium on this topic without actually watching such a bird flocking. This actually had sound, but the sound doesn't seem to be working. There was kind of some nice music to work with the flocking, but it doesn't seem to go. But that's okay. So what you see here, then I will talk over it. So what you see here is this large collection of starlings. Probably about could be as many as 100,000 in this video. They move together, bending and folding, sort of like a fluid or a soft gel in the sky. And the question is whether we can describe this kind of behavior using statistical physics. And what really started the field was work done in 1995 by Tamas Vicek, who essentially, inspired by the physics of magnetism, was able to describe flocking as a phase transition. In reality, the model that Vicek developed was actually already in the computer science literature. It had been developed some years earlier by Craig Reynolds, who also used it in animation and in fact won an Oscar or two for his work. But physicists now call it the Vicek model. And essentially, it consists in the following. So you think of a bird as a flying XY spin. And the spin is really the velocity of the bird. The speed is fixed. The only thing that can change is the direction in which the birds fly, which is updated according to a simple rule that says that the bird wants to align with the neighbors within a certain region of a prescribed radius, but with noise. The birds can make mistakes. And the order parameter, this is really like a phase transition. In fact, it's now established that it is actually a first order phase transition. The order parameter is the velocity. At low density or high noise, the mean velocity is 0. The birds are pointing in all directions. And at high density or low noise, there is a non-zero mean velocity, and that's the flocking state. If you simulate this model on a computer, in fact, you actually see the flocking. And there are also strong density inhomogeneities, which are actually, as we will see again shortly, a typical phenomenon. These large density fluctuations are actually typical of active systems. So in some sense, Vicek's work really started the field because people realized that phenomena such as the collective motion you see in nature or in many, many other systems could be described as a phase transition, or as we say nowadays, often an emergent phenomenon. And this was really a new paradigm that has had a lot of influence in the study of both the soft matter system and actually even truly living matter. Now, today, this name of active matter, more generally, we use it to refer to any collection of active particles, which are, if you like, you could think of them as an engine that consume energy to generate its own motion and forces. So bacteria that are actually engineered microswimmers, a bird, a human being. These are all active particles, and active matter is a collection of such interacting engines that exhibit emergent behavior at large scales. And we have examples on a very, very large set of length scales from biopolymers and small multiprotein that organize structures inside the cell and actually even inside the nucleus, to synthetic microswimmers. I'll give you an example in a bit, bacteria, cells, a collection of robots, and even on our scale, epithelial paradigm has even been used to describe the behavior of human crowds. And so what is in common here is that this energy input at the scale of the single particle cascades to large scale in driving these collective dynamics and organization. And then it's really a new kind of non-equilibrium matter or material. And we have active fluids, active solids, active gases. And so it's matter made not of atoms, but of these entities that generate their own motion. And physicists started asking the kind of questions they usually ask for materials. What kind of states are possible? What do we tune to change from one state to another? As we will see, it's not going to be the temperature, but like in the Defect model, it might actually be the density, or it might be a different parameters such as the motility of these entities. Can we classify the behaviors and identify generic properties and maybe identify new universality classes of active matter? Now, of course, the Defect model belongs to a class of what we call ferromagnetic active matter. The birds, the particles, are polar entities. They have a head and a tail, and they order in a state which has ferromagnetic order. What I will do today is tell you two examples of two different other classes of active matter. One is systems that actually don't have a preferred orientation. They're just spherical active colloids, as we call them. And we call this a scalar active matter. And the other one is particles that are active. They exert forces on their surrounding, but they're head-tail symmetric and order in states with liquid crystalline, so-called nematic order. And there are actually many, many examples of such type of order. And by the way, if anybody has questions, please feel free to interrupt me and ask me questions during the talk. So the heading here says a new kind of non-equilibrium matter. Well, why new? What is different here? After all, we've been studying non-equilibrium systems for a long time. And so what is really new and different here? Why is active matter different? To understand that, I want to first of all go back to something familiar to everybody, which is Brownian motion. The famous jiggling of pollen of grain in water or in air. So here is our Brownian particle is sitting in a fluid in equilibrium, and the dynamics is driven. And first of all, it experiences a drag due to the surrounding fluid. That's sort of the mean effect of the surrounding fluid. But in addition, it experiences random kicks from water molecules that drive actually the motion. So the fluid provides both the drag, the dissipation, and the drive, which is modeled here as a random force proportional to temperature with Gaussian white noise. Now, as we learned from Ed Purcell, for these large beads, we can actually neglect inertia. So the dynamics is really just simply force balance. And it's very simply the balance of, again, the dissipation and the drive that both come from the fluid in equilibrium. And so because the equilibrium fluid provides both this effect, there is the system exhibits what's called the detailed balance. At the coarse grain level, the rate of forward and reverse processes are the same. You can calculate the mean. Of course, the Brownian particle goes nowhere on average, but you calculate its mean square displacement is diffusive, grows linearly with time. And the diffusion coefficient is related to the drag through the temperature. That's the Einstein relation, which arises because of this detailed balance. And it's also an example of what we call the fluctuation dissipation theorem. So again, the equilibrium fluid provides both dissipation and drive, and that leads to the fluctuation dissipation theorem. An active particle, such as the bacterium, is a little different. It's also swimming in a fluid. It experiences drag. It experiences the drive, the random kicks from the water molecules. But the drive provided by these random kicks is actually negligible compared to the internally generated drive. This bacteria consumes food to swim. And as a result, there is an imbalance between dissipation and drive. There is no fluctuation dissipation theorem. The dynamics of these individual active particles does not satisfy time reversal symmetry. And so an active system is a collection of such particles where each one breaks time reversal symmetry locally and in a sustained matter. And it's very different from what, say, you do when you apply an external electric field, where all the particles are driven in the same way. And this is what is really different by active matter, and it poses an important challenge to the statistical physicists, which is that of describing the statistical mechanics of a system that breaks time reversal symmetry at the micro scale, because actually our statistical mechanics is fundamentally based on the notion of time reversal symmetry and detailed balance. Yes?
Matter of driving much bigger than the Brownian motion. Is there any system where it's like lightly active, where the Brownian motion is on the order of the activity of the particles?
That is possible. I'm not quite. So the question is whether I'm supposed to repeat the question. The question is whether I'm defining active matter as a system where the internal drive is much bigger than the Brownian drive, let's call it, and whether there are systems where that's not true. I'm not quite defining. I'm defining active matter as a collection of particles that are independently self-driven. That's really the main thing. You could have thermal noise. In some cases, it might be important. In most cases, it's not, simply because these particles are big, but it could be important. But the important thing is that these particles are internally and independently driven. And so, as opposed to be all driven in the same way. That's really the definition. Any other question? Okay, so that's really what is important, the difference here. So if we want to model one of these this kind of system, physicists like minimal models. So let's start with a minimal model, what's called an active Brownian particle. And I'm going to neglect inertia. And I am going to say an active Brownian particle is a spherical bead that actually has a propulsive, there's a body axis here that I define, I attach to the bead, and there is a propulsive force along this axis. The speed is, or the strength of the propulsive force is fixed, and the only thing that can change randomly due to noise is the direction of motion, which changes at a rate 1 over tau. I will call tau the persistence time, because tau is the time over which the particle goes in a straight line or ballistically before having its direction changed by noise. So the dynamics is extremely simple. I just balance drag and drive, and then I have this random diffusion of the direction of motion. In fact, I can also rewrite the dynamics as saying that I actually have noise on the velocity, which is now no longer white, but actually correlated in time with this time scale that I call the persistence time. Now, this kind of system has actually been realized experimentally. So here, I'm going to show you, this is a video in a second. What these little dots are essentially plastic beads that have a little piece of a material called hematite embedded in them. Hematite is actually a magnetic material, but what matters for our purposes is that when you shine UV light on hematite, it actually these beads actually swim in a solution that contains hydrogen peroxide. As you know, hydrogen peroxide can break up in oxygen and water, and that the hematite catalyzes the breakdown of hydrogen peroxide, but only when you shine UV light. These are experiments done some years ago in the lab of Paul Chaikin at NYU. And the video will tell you when the light is on or off. So when the light is off, these beads are just regular passive Brownian particles. But when the light is on, due to the asymmetry of the chemical reactions, they turn into swimmers. And in fact, they actually swim at a speed very comparable to the speed of, say, E. coli. So they're like synthetic bacteria, if you like. They are your active Brownian particles, and you see their persistent dynamics. Now, if you calculate the mean square displacement of one, so they perform persistent random walks. If you calculate the mean square displacement of one of these particles, it's just diffusive. It's pretty boring. And the diffusion coefficient is determined by the speed and the persistence time. And so a natural question would be the following. Well, we can then define an effective temperature, which you can calculate, and will turn out to be about 100 times bigger than the thermal temperature. So these active particles are just like half colloids. And this seems, again, pretty boring, but the situation changes if you add interactions. You have now many particles, and I'm adding strictly repulsive interactions. So I have self-propelled billiard balls, and each one of them performs this persistence dynamics. I have a persistence length I can define. And in fact, one way of quantifying activity is through a dimensionless number that we call the Peclet number, although we should really call it a rotational Peclet number, which is the ratio of the persistence length to the particle size. So if you simulate a collection of these particles on a computer, what you find is that they condense. Now, in equilibrium, you need attractive interactions for things to condense. So they condense, they form these dense liquid-like regions surrounded by an active gas. And this happens with just repulsive interaction. So the motility and the persistence of the dynamics is crucial, because in reality, it turns out this is a bit of like a traffic jam, leads to this condensation.
Cristina, can I ask a question?
Yes.
There looks like there's stripes inside the liquid.
Yes, these particles are monodispersed, these ones, and so they're actually forming crystalline structures with grain boundaries. So you're seeing the kind of the grain boundaries.
Thank you.
And in fact, actually, it turns out that they're probably not crystalline, they're probably hexatic, but this is all 2D. My talk is 2D. I should have said that at the beginning. I have a 2D talk. Yes. Thank you for the question. Yes.
Would this be related to accretion at all?
Accretion, meaning.
Things will accrete and, form gas clouds.
Well, in a sense, I mean, this comes from motility. Give me a minute, I'll explain it to you. But in that case, I think there are attractive interactions. Here, there are no attractive interactions. Okay, that's really the difference. So this phenomenon has been called motility-induced phase separation, and as we'll see, has been seen in many different systems. Why does this happen? Well, a very simple way to understand it is that these systems don't have detailed balance. So the flux into the cluster is different from the flux out of the cluster. This is an argument that was due actually to Aparna Bhaskaran, who is here in the audience today. Essentially, the flux into the cluster is proportional to the density of the gas trying the propulsion speed V naught. But for the flux out, depends on the persistence, because these particles have to turn their nose around before they can leave the cluster. And so this imbalance leads to accumulation. Slightly more detailed way. So first of all, there has been a lot of large-scale simulations in 2D and 3D of this kind of phenomenon. And there's been also developed a rather detailed effective continuum theory derived from the microscopic dynamics. So this motility-induced phase separation is really a generic phenomenon of active systems. Just to understand it a little bit better, what you can do, you can start with the microscopic Langevin type equations, derive a Fokker-Planck equation for the probability of finding one of these particles at position R and orientation theta. And the repulsive interactions that here come in through this convolution kernel, you can see there'll be a contribution for this repulsive interaction that can be cast as a renormalization of the propulsive speed. And in fact, it leads to a density-dependent propulsive speed that is smaller and in fact can even vanish, and smaller than the bare one. You can do one more step of coarse graining and transform this into a diffusion equation with a diffusion coefficient that is nonlinear function of density and can become negative. And so really this can be mapped onto what's called the Cahn-Hilliard or a 5-4 theory, and the system exhibits a spinodal instability. And so it's a true phase with some modification due to the non-equilibrium, but it's a true essentially first order type of phase transition. Now, so essentially what's happening here is that crowding suppresses the velocity. And these particles accumulate where they slow down. In fact, a steady state solution of this nonlinear diffusion equation is one where the density goes like the inverse of the propulsive velocity, which itself depends on density, and is decreased by density. And so there is a feedback here that leads to the instability. And of course, this is very different from Brownian motion. Diffusion, Brownian motion, suppresses density inhomogeneities. Eventually, you get a constant density everywhere, while at this type of activity, as we call it, tends to build up density inhomogeneities. So the lesson here is that active particles, very simple, active particles accumulate where they slow down, phenomenon that we all know, familiar phenomenon is really like a traffic jam. But it has been seen in a number of different systems, and it's relevant also to the accumulation of bacteria when starved. For instance, going back to our light-activated colloids, if you have a higher density of them, when the light is on and they're self-propelled, they will actually form, in this case, these crystalline type of clusters. And when the light is off, which will be in a second, they lose their motility and the clusters simply dissolve. And this has been seen by quite a number of people. They should be dissolving any moment. Now they're dissolving. Starved bacteria. This is a soil-dwelling bacteria, myxobacteria. When it's starved, it forms this cluster from where it forms then fruiting bodies. And this cluster formation has been understood. We actually, working with the group of Josh Shevitz at Princeton, we were able to map the behavior, to understand the behavior semi-quantitatively in terms of this motility-induced phase separation. And I couldn't help yesterday or a couple of days ago adding one slide here when I saw this paper by Alberto Fernandez Nieves, who is now in Barcelona. And the title said, social interactions lead to motility-induced phase separation in fire ants. And this is a video accelerated about 50 times. So the time scale is minutes and seconds. And the claim here is that the interactions, which are really, well, they're complicated between the fire ants, can be sort of mapped into these models of motility-induced phase separation. Anyway, that was just for fun. Okay, so a sort of generic property of active systems is the spontaneous aggregation in the absence of any attractive interaction. Another generic property of active systems is that, which is direct consequence of the broken time reversal symmetry, is that if you consider now a multi-species active system, two types of active particles, the effective interactions seem to evade Newton's third law, the Newton's third law of action-reaction, or as we say, the interaction become non-reciprocal. I'll explain what I mean in a minute, but what I'm showing you here now is actually a simulation of a mixture of active and passive particles. The active are red, the passive are blue. Their interactions are only repulsive everywhere. And if the active particles like to phase separate, so they will form these big clusters surrounded by a gas. But now in the presence of the passive component, the interaction between the two species become non-reciprocal, and this actually sets the static pattern into motion. The dense and dilute regions are at a constant drift with a relative speed, sort of like in a prey-predator model when the predator doesn't succeed at catching the prey, of course. Now, we can actually understand this quite well by constructing a coarse-grained dynamics for the system in terms of the concentration of active particles and the concentration of passive particles. The concentration of active particles can be described by a 5-4 type theory, a Cahn-Hilliard equation, where the diffusion coefficient of the active particle is negative from the active crowding I described before, and can set up this phase separation where you have regions of high density of active and high and low density of the two species. But in addition, the cross diffusion coefficient for the active passive diffusion can also go negative, because the motility of the active particle is suppressed by both active and passive particles, if you like. Instead, the passive particles simply satisfy a diffusion equation. So what you have is a situation where the cross diffusion coefficients are non-reciprocal. In fact, you can, in an extreme situation, one can be positive, one can be negative. And what happens is that the outcome is a parity time translational symmetry, or PT symmetry breaking transition, that sets the static pattern into motion. Essentially, the non-reciprocity of the interaction breaks the reflection parity of the pattern, and the breaking of time reversal symmetry of the active system sets them into motion. It's really kind of a run and catch kind of scenario, as you can see here with this cartoon of the donkey with the with the carrot, where species A tries to run away, species B tries to catch up but never does, and the two patterns are set in a constant drift relative to each other. And this is really a generic mechanism. It turns out these non-reciprocal interactions, which are ubiquitous in active system, provide a generic mechanism for setting up time-dependent phases, either traveling states or oscillatory states. And in fact, there is also a connection between these and PT breaking transitions in open quantum many-body systems with a non-emission evolution operator that David actually has also worked on. And that's actually one of the things that active matter community is very interested in right now, is in exploring the consequences of these non-reciprocal interactions. So this really minimal model of an active system, self-propelled beads, if you like, self-propelled hard beads, has actually led to significant progress in the field. We have learned that spontaneous condensation of purely repulsive active particle is a generic property of active matter. Using this model, we have been able to really develop a rather quantitative theory, really starting from microscopic, predicting phase transitions, and even understanding the effective thermodynamics of these systems, the pressure, surface tension, chemical potential, which are quite unusual. A topic, as I said, of recent interest is this of non-reciprocal interaction and the resulting PT breaking transition. And there's also been quite a bit of progress in understanding how to quantify the departure from equilibrium of active systems that are continuously producing entropy and therefore evade thermalization. Some of the ongoing challenges are essentially the question of whether can we get useful work out of this active system. This thing I'm showing you here is from the lab of Roberto Di Leonardo in Rome few years ago, is a gear immersed in a bacterial bath. And as you see, the bacteria, this gear is asymmetric, and the bacteria drive the wheel to rotate. So the asymmetry of the wheel breaks time spatial symmetry. The bacterial bath breaks time reversal symmetry. And this results in a spontaneous current that gets the wheel to rotate. Now, the question is, can we extract useful work from these, perhaps by attaching a counter load that imposing an opposing torque, as shown in this cartoon over here from a recent paper. So basically developing generic principles for the design of what we could call active engines to go along with the thermodynamic engines we understand so well is very much an open area of research. And from an experimental point of view, the engineering of micro or even nano machines with tunable and controllable motility are also very much open questions. Sounds like I might be ending, but I'm not. Sorry. So that was our minimal model of self-propelled beads. Now I would like to tell you, spend a little bit more time telling you about sort of a active system where now orientational order comes into play. And these are these nematic active matter, where the interplay of orientational order and flow becomes very, very interesting. So first of all, a nematic liquid crystal, well, exists all over the place. It's simply a fluid of rod-like molecules that, as you either increase the density or lower the temperature, may undergo a transition from a state where the rod points in all directions, that's isotropic liquid, to a state where on average they have the same orientation, that's a nematic liquid crystal. Material with very anisotropic properties and for light transmission, for instance. Now, this is a head-tail symmetric system. The orientational order is identified by this unit vector, the director, but it's really a headless or two-headed vector. And so the order parameter is not a vector, but it's a rank 2 tensor known as the Q tensor or the alignment tensor. S is the magnitude of nematic order, and N is the broken symmetry variable that is known as the director. That's a passive nematic liquid crystal. An active nematic liquid crystal is composed of elongated particles that exert forces on their environment. These are bacteria, these Myxococcus. They come out not too well, but it's again from the lab of John Shevitz. And the color actually denotes the orientation. So you see there is appreciable amount of nematic order. And each one of these rods, these bacteria actually go back and forth, so exert forced dipoles on their surroundings. They go nowhere on average, but they generate, this forced dipole generates this kind of flows. So that's an example of an active nematic liquid crystal. In reality, the reason, so the sort of iconical example of active nematic liquid crystal is the system here, again 2D, that was developed by Zvonimir Dodig at Brandeis a number of years ago. This is a suspension of long biofilaments extracted from living cells called microtubules, cross-linked by clusters of molecular motors. Molecular motors are really nanomachines that convert chemical energy into forces, step onto these filaments, driving the filaments to move relative to each other. And so a bundle of this filament is an active entity that exerts force dipoles on the surroundings. And when you have a suspension, that suspension of this system here is at an oil-water interface, in the presence of the fuel that this motor protein use, the system exhibits these self-sustained flows. You see a substantial amount of alignment, orientational order, nematic order, and these self-sustained flows. Now, nematic order is actually quite common in active system. It has been seen in monolayer or vertically vibrated rods, sheets of cells that also just travel back and forth going nowhere of average, and even entire organisms such this freshwater animal hydra that I think Maha has been modeling, also studying, not quite in his lab. I don't think the lab has gone quite that far, right, as to doing work with hydra. But so it's a ubiquitous type of order and more subtle, if you like, than ferromagnetic order. Now, as both in equilibrium and in active system. In equilibrium, you might get a nematic liquid crystal by quenching the system from high to low temperature through the transition. And you will find a line region interrupted by topological defects, which are strong deformation of the order, which are quantified by their charge or winding number, which is the angle through which the order parameter turns when you circle the defect core by a complete turn, 360 degrees. In a nematic liquid crystal, which is the order state are just parallel line, the defects have a half integer charge because see here, the director will only turn 180 degrees when you go around the distortion by a full circle. And they have these two typical structure, the -1f, which has this triangular symmetry, and the +1f that looks like a comet, and you can find them on your fingertips. In equilibrium, defects really behave like charges. Opposite sign pair attract with Coulomb-like interaction. And so if you wait long enough, the two defects will come together, annihilate, and you get order. But in these active systems, defects are actually continuously generated and proliferate. In fact, these defect anti-defect pairs are spontaneously generated and annihilated in the system, like pair creation from the vacuum, and drive the dynamics. And so we have these self-sustained flows that are kind of like turbulent, and there are no external forces applied to the system here. And these actually look a lot like flows inside the cytoplasm of living cells. And the other thing that you notice is that opposite sign defects, the arrows point to a plus and minus defect, they actually look as if they were repelling each other instead of attracting, or at least they're moving away from each other for certain configuration as a function of time. What's happening there? I guess telling me I should move on. Now, these forces, what drives the flow here, as I said, are the forces that this bundle of microtubule exert on the surrounding when are being moved around by the motor protein. And more precisely, the net force is always zero. These forces always come in dipoles, opposite sign pair. And if we add up all the force dipoles on a given fluid element, we can define a quantity that we call the active stress. And clearly, this active stress will depend on the filament orientation. In fact, you can calculate it, and you will find that the active stress is proportional to the order parameter. Remember, that was what I call the Q tensor, through a coefficient that I call activity that depends on the molecular processes that drive the flow. So here it might depend on the concentration of kinesin of motor protein, and the concentration of the fuel that the motor protein use to actually generate forces. And this particular system I'm interested in here, it's called extensile because the forces are always pointing out. This alpha happens to be negative. But there are systems such as the atomizing cytoskeleton where actually the forces can be contractile and also have active phenomena occur. So to describe this kind of systems, we can actually develop a continuum model, hydrodynamic type model. How am I doing? Okay.
You started 5 or 10 minutes late.
Okay. Okay. So a model that has been used extensively to describe this kind of system is essentially hydrodynamic equations. These are equations that assume the density is constant. We are at fairly high density here, and it kind of remains constant. So they are equations for the flow velocity and the orientational order described by this Q tensor. The Q tensor itself can be, so we can certainly write a free energy, which we would write for a passive liquid crystal, where we have two terms here, a term in Q squared, a term in Q to the 4th, which set up essentially this is the term that describes the transition between the isotropic and the nematic state. And we place ourselves in a nematic state where this is a double well potential. And then there is a term here that accounts for the energy cost for generating spatial inhomogeneity in the order parameter for turning your orientational order with a stiffness K. There is a characteristic length scale in this free energy, essentially the coherence length that really describe the length scale over which the nematic turns isotropic, which is the ratio of the stiffness to the condensation energy. And essentially it also represents the size of the core of the defects, which are essentially normal regions. And it's very short in the regime of parameter and in the system I'm interested in here. So it's a free energy, certainly equilibrium so far. Now I want to write down the hydrodynamic equations. The dynamics of the Q tensor itself is controlled by relaxation, described by this free energy, and coupling to flow, because vorticity of the flow or gradients of the flow will turn the orientation. And so they deform the orientational order and distort the nematic liquid crystal. The flow velocity, I'm in a regime of low Reynolds number, essentially inertia is negligible. So instead of writing a Navier-Stokes equation, I write a Stokes equation that balances forces. And in fact, these systems are generally on a substrate. So I also have friction with the substrate here. And the other forces are pressure gradient, viscous stresses, elastic stresses associated with deformation of the direction of order, and these active stresses I mentioned a minute before ago that are written here in terms of the Q tensor. And the active stresses are the ones that drive the flow. They provide a source for the flow that then distorts the orientation, and there is a feedback between the two that leads to this continuous turbulent-like dynamics. There is a second length scale introduced by the active stresses, which is essentially determined by balancing elastic stresses versus active stresses. We call it the active length, is the square root of the stiffness to the activity. And one can show that this length scale essentially controls the mean separation between the defects in these kind of systems. Now, if you really follow the equation, doesn't matter. We can develop we can write down a continuum model. And if we simulate the continuum model on a computer, we reproduce very much the dynamics seen in the experiments. So what these two videos show, the one on the left, the color is the magnitude of the order parameter. So blue when it's 0 and red when it's strong. And the lines are the direction of orientational order, the director field. And to the right, I'm showing the flow. And the color is vorticity. So what you see here is vortices, counter-rotating vortices, and defects actually being unbound in the region of high shear between two counter-rotating vortices, and you have this essentially type of dynamics that was seen. And this is really a dynamical steady state with a constant number of topological defects being present. Now the question is, can we describe these dynamics in terms of the topological defects alone? And why would we want to do that? Well, because in equilibrium, we know that order-disorder transition into dimensions are actually described, I'm sure you all studied in a class, as defect unbinding transition, the Kosterlitz-Thouless transition. And so we would like to understand the onset of this turbulent flow as sort of a defect unbinding transition. Now, the first thing you can understand very easily is the fact that the +1F defects in this system, the comet-like defects, really behave like a self-propelled particles. Because I've written here a simplified form of the Stokes equation where I've dropped some terms and I've only retained the active stresses, friction, and viscous dissipation. So the active stresses act as a force for the flow, as a source for flow. Now the defects are distortion of the order parameter. In fact, they're very strong distortion. So I can put on this side of the equation the structure of the order parameter corresponding to a defect and calculate the flow that the defects generates. And I will find for the +1F defects, I will find that the flow consists of two counter-rotating vortices. But the important point is that the net flow is non-zero at the core of the defect. So the defect generates a flow which is non-zero at the core, and the defect itself becomes like a self-propelled particle. It rides along with the flow it itself generates. The -1F defect generates an even more complex flow with 6 vortices, but by symmetry, the velocity is 0 at the core, and so this can be thought of as a passive particles. And it's actually also interesting that the direction of motion of the +1F defects will be controlled by the sign of the activity. For extensile forces like the ones we are talking about here, the +1F defects moves in the direction of the comet. But for contractile force of the head of the comet, for contractile forces, it will go the other way. And this is actually has been quite a useful thing to notice because, first of all, the presence of these plus or half integer defects, it's what tells you that the system is a nematic as opposed to a polar system. The direction of motion of the defects tells you about the nature of the active stresses, which is something that you cannot tell a priori. So that has been quite, was kind of an interesting realization here. So, but the point here is that the +1F defects in this system becomes like a self-propelled particles. And so now the question that we addressed some here before was in equilibrium, we know that the defects dynamics can be, the statistical physics of defects can be mapped onto a Coulomb gas, and that's how you describe then order-disorder transition as Kosterlitz-Thouless defect unbinding transition. It turns out that you can actually do a similar mapping for these active systems, starting from the hydrodynamic equations I showed you before. And you can show that the dynamics of active defects maps onto a gas of self-propelled particles, the +1F, and passive particles, the -1F, with Coulomb-like charges, so interacting with each other with Coulomb-like interactions. This work was done by Suraj Shankar, who is here in the audience. You can then show that indeed you can think of this active turbulence as a defect unbinding transition. And I just want to spend the last few minutes giving you an argument as to why that is. Let's think, it's a very simple argument. Let's think about a one-dimensional model where I have the two defects facing each other this way. The +1F is self-propelled along its head, and the -1F it's not. So these two defects interact via Coulomb interaction, where the strength is the stiffness of the nematic, and it's logarithmic because we are in 2 dimensions. I hope that's not my phone. And the dynamics, therefore, is controlled by the +1F is also self-propelled. So the dynamics is controlled by the interplay of the self-propulsion of the +1F and the Coulomb attraction between the two defects. We can rewrite, so in some sense, the self-propulsion acts like an electric field, but an electric field that only acts on one of the two defects. So we can rewrite this interaction as an effective potential, and this potential will have a maximum at a position that is determined by the balance of these two forces. And so any noise can allow escape a la Kramer over this hump, over this barrier, and escaping the barrier corresponds to the unbinding of the two defects. So there is defect in this simple one-dimensional picture. We always will have defect unbinding controlled by the interplay between the Coulomb repulsion, and which comes from the passive nematic elasticity, and the motility of the +1F defect. But in reality, this 1D model, these +1F defects are really self-propelled particles. Remember, they undergo persistent random walks. They have a persistence length. And the 1D model, we only hold on length scales less than the persistence length. It's only on length scale less than the persistence length that you can say these defects are traveling ballistically in a straight line. So the defect unbinding will only occur if the distance to the barrier is less than the persistence length. And this gives you a very simple estimate for the defect unbinding transition. The persistence line depends on activity, and we'll have a defect unbinding transition that depends on activity. We actually did a better calculation than this, but these are just kind of giving you a simple argument. And then you can find a transition line in the activity nematic elasticity plane between a state where defects will not unbound, that's homogeneous nematic order, and the state where defects unbind, but because the defects are then motile, that's this state that we call defect chaos or turbulent-like dynamics. The transition temperature, we can calculate it by solving Fokker-Planck equation for the dynamics of a defect pair. And that's very much the form of it can be written in a form which is very much the form of the equilibrium isotropic nematic transition in 2 dimensions, with a stiffness that is reduced by activity due to this sort of persistent random walk of the +1f defect. Okay, so I am about to finish. Yes, was there a question? Oh, yes, of course they are, but we only looked at we haven't really put that in. We only looked so far at the dynamics of defects that can unwind. You can put in annihilation rate, but nobody has really been able to calculate in detail the annihilation rate, which will require a microscopic calculation. So yes and no. Okay.
They are annihilating in your simulation.
They certainly are annihilating in the simulations. Yes, they are annihilating in the simulation, and that's okay. So I just wanted to finish sort of with a teaser of a rather recent work. So the point what I was telling is that defects drive the flows and flows drive the dynamics of the defects. There is really a duality between the two, almost I would call it. In fact, you can show that the same line scales control the statistical flow vortices and the statistics of the defects. And so the idea here is that if you can control the defects, you can control the flows and perhaps use these systems for useful applications in microfluidics or something else. And so there has been a lot of interest in doing either controlling the defects and controlling the flow. Now, experimentally, this has become possible thanks to what are called optogenetically modified motor protein, essentially motor protein where activity can be switched on and off using light. And in particular, these are experiments carried out at Caltech, where essentially they use the microtubule kinesin system that I described before, this long filament cross-linked by motor protein. But by combining the motor protein with essentially light-sensitive protein extracted from plants, they are able to generate a kinesin that can be activated or not by light. And this little circle over here is the region where light is shining, and so is the active region. And what they've been able to do is do things like this. They are able to actually use light activation to sort of create this, in this case, aster, this agglomerate of defects corresponding to an aster, and actually move it around. You see, as long as you move your light region not too fast, I think 200 nanometers per second or less, this aster will actually follow the light activated region. And we've been playing around essentially with the goal of designing. Now you can imagine doing something similar in your continuum model, designing a pattern of activity that will act sort of like a topological tweezer and allow you to move around the defects. And this is actually work done again by Suraj with what was a great undergraduate at UCSB, Luca Scharer, now at the University of Chicago. And what you can see here is that essentially this is the 3D rendering of the trajectories. So we generate suitable, no, I didn't, okay, let's see if we can play it again. Oh. Okay, there. So we grab the defects with specific patterns of activity and move them around. And so you can start possibly developing spatial and temporal control of the defect dynamics and associated spatial and temporal control of the flows. And the dream here is that you might be able to design sort of programmable active matter that you can use for transport or even to design logic circuit or something like that. And okay, so I just want to conclude essentially, summarizing some of the things I've been describing to you. So I hope I convinced you that there is new physics in active matter coming from cell propulsion. phase transition, for instance, tuned by motility or persistence of the dynamics. One generic properties of active particles is that they will organize or aggregate when passive ones would not, even without any attractive interactions. The active systems generally exhibit spontaneous flow without any externally applied forces. And the hope is to learn how to control this flow using either light, geometry, or so on to produce actually coherent motion. A question that is very much at the center of current research is how do we quantify the relation between information, work, and heat, the thermodynamics of active systems, if you like. And clearly we need to do this if we really want to be able to develop a predictive framework for understanding biological organization and also building what I call active engines. And I haven't really told you anything about how active matter has impacted through living systems, for instance, the understanding of collective cell migrations or even the understanding of morphogenesis, which is something, I mean, I should say that actually I think the active matter paradigm has had quite an important impact on that. And I'll say something about this perhaps in my talk on Wednesday. So David mentioned the review we wrote in 2013. Here are two more recent ones. Actually, more than a review, especially the first one, is sort of an outlook paper that came out of a program we had at KITP in 2020, which was supposed to be in person and to start basically on the day in which everything closed due to the pandemic. And so, and then it turned into a virtual program, but it was a very nice way, especially in those early days of the pandemic, of remaining connected, as a matter of fact, and it was great. So with that, I thank you, and I just wanted to show you, so this is actually my current group at in Santa Barbara. I used to have a Zoom picture here, but now we are out again. And here are some of the recent collaborators that have contributed in various ways to the work that I talked about today, or I will talk about tomorrow or Wednesday. So thank you again. Thanks for listening.
So there have been lots of questions along the way, but I think there's time, perhaps Cristina can answer a few more.
So this is physics of active matter. I'm a chemist, but I'm interested in active matter. And I'm wondering how much is done when we, in addition to completely uniform, let's take first part of your talk, spherical particles with no symmetry in them, or at least no molecular asymmetry in them. There's a lot going on trying to make the material itself, let's say, doped with chiral features.
Yeah.
So you introduce breaking of symmetry at the molecular level, and how one can explain or at least describe the behavior of these spherical particles if they, in addition to symmetries defined by active matter, have molecular asymmetries and potentially asymmetry of the medium. For example, you would have chiral solvent.
Yes.
Just as one example, it could be many others.
No, those are very interesting questions. I think if I understand correctly, you meant whether my particle remain spherical, say, but they have some other asymmetry that might lead. I mean, these are very interesting questions, and there has certainly been a lot of numerical work on things like this. For instance, Ramin Golestanian has done work of this type. And you're absolutely right. I think it's very interesting to ask about the emergence of asymmetry from things that are asymmetric. For instance, the emergence of chirality now, I should say that this type of what I call active colloids, even though they're spherical, because their interactions are mediated by a non-equilibrium medium, generally the interaction, first of all, are non-reciprocal, or can be even sometimes lead to chirality. So those are systems which this kind of things really do happen. So I think that's very interesting direction.
Well, you want to call them I think there's a question there.
So I have a question regarding your hydrodynamic theory for nematic active matter. So in there, you adopted some free energy structure in order to drive terms that couples to nematic tensor. And if you do that, then the resulting terms will come out to be reciprocal to each tensor component. At the same time, you showed us that the terms in the hydrodynamic equation for active matter can be non-reciprocal. So what will happen if you make these terms in the nematic hydrodynamic theory non-reciprocal?
Well, so I don't know how to make them necessarily. So you're absolutely right. My hydrodynamic theory of active matter, the only place where activity came in was this active stress. Everything else was taken from equilibrium. And first of all, I should say that in principle, all the parameters, the stiffness, the condensation energy, they can all depend on activity, okay? And that requires microscopic derivations. If I just have a single active nematic fluid, single type of particles, I'm not sure how to make it non-reciprocal, although actually, yeah, I can, in some sense, active matter is always non-reciprocal if you think of non-reciprocity as the breaking of detail balance. And so the fact that this has that feature already makes it non-reciprocal. Otherwise, I could consider two type. So I don't know whether you want to think of non-reciprocity as just non-reciprocity between two species, then I need two species. But really, I think you could think of it as a more general way, as active matter really always been non-reciprocal. So I don't know, probably didn't answer your question, but.
I see a question right there.
Thank you very much for your talk. I had a question about the role of matter in active matter. So for example, in the case that you have flocks of birds, etc., or fish, you have hydrodynamic interactions that things like the Defect model do not take into account.
Yep.
And I guess the other two also that you mentioned also have hydrodynamic interactions, but I'm not sure if these are taken into account. So I was wondering, do you think these hydrodynamic interactions are important? Are people, what are the directions to incorporate them in these models?
So people have looked at the role of hydrodynamic interactions, for instance, in bacterial systems. And the hydrodynamic interactions can be important. In the nematic system I showed you here, it was, and that's also true for the bacteria. At high density, hydrodynamic interactions are cut off and they're generally not important. They're certainly important if you deal with fish, they're important. In the birds, surprisingly, they don't seem to be. And the reason I say they don't seem to be is that experimentalists in Rome, well, experimentalists, they're theorists really, but well, Parisi and Irene Giardina and Andrea Cavagna's so-called star flag collaboration, they have actually tracked the motion of big flocks of starlings, and they've developed computer algorithms to really track the trajectories and see whether they could fit the behavior using this Defect type model. And well, they had to make one modification. The modification was what they found is that the birds, the starlings, I should say, don't seem to interact with the neighbors within a certain circle, but they always interact with the closest 6 or 7 neighbors, no matter how far they are. And that's, we call it topological as opposed to metric interaction, but that's not very important. But given that modification, they were actually able to fit a lot of the behavior using a Defect type model, suggesting that in that case, hydrodynamic interactions are not important. But hydrodynamic interactions can be important. For instance, hydrodynamic interactions actually suppress motility-induced phase separation. So yes, they are important and people are looking at them.
Thank you very much for a wonderful talk. I have a question experimentally about where alpha has been measured.
Sorry, about what?
About the activity. Where has the activity been measured? In particular, is it really a constant? And I'm trying to combine what you talked about in the second part to the first part.
Well, I don't think the activity is a constant, and I absolutely, if you, am I going to talk about this tomorrow? No, I was going to say, if you come to my talk tomorrow, I will tell you, but actually I'm probably not going to say. So yes, activity has been very hard to measure. So recently, Zvonimir has done this work on interfaces, the interfaces between the dynamics of interfaces with active and passive nematic. And by comparing his experiments with some models that we enable, we claim to be able to extract the value of activity from two separate measurements. And one is the interfacial fluctuations, essentially, and one is actually wetting, and we get a similar value. Now, what is that activity? For us, the activity is this parameter alpha, right? And for him, is a combination of kinesin concentration, and that's in these experiments, that's what they change in the kinesin concentration. And certainly in these experiments, it doesn't look like the activity is constant. It looks like it's changing in time, as a matter of fact, because, well, the activity kind of saturates. And so, yes. I don't know of a system where it has really convincingly been measured in some.
But is it fair to say that you can, even the old experiments, you can get the sign of alpha?
Yes, well, okay. Sign of alpha, for instance, if you have a nematic, you can get it from the topological defects. And generally you can tell the sign of alpha, yes, but not its value.
Okay, and I urge you all to come back tomorrow and hear further beautiful results. Let's thank Cristina once again for